Along the north shore of the St. Lawrence River lies the oldest part of settled Canada. In 300 years, the dense forest, once the domain of the voyageurs and the coureurs de bois, has given way to closely settled farmlands. Some of these have been tilled for 7 and 8 generations. But winter snows reveal that in 300 years, the farms have crept back from the river barely 10 miles. Though man has brought the wilderness under his hand, the frontier is never very far away. Beyond the big cities and settled farms of Canada, north of the old towns and the great railroads, lies a land where men are still pioneers. Harsh ribs of rock cutting the clear sky enfold sparkling blue lakes. Among the rocks lie stretches of jagged spruce bordering spongy muskegs. Artists early felt the call of this frontier land, but the first to paint it were schooled in the traditions of the old world, steeped in its mannerisms. The paintings of Cornelius Krieghoff, who died in 1872, give a charming and accurate picture of manners and customs, but the treatment is European. Then men like Maurice Cullen began to look at Canada through Canadian eyes, and in the years before the First Great War, a group of young Canadians sounded a new note. That note is expressed in The Jack Pine by Tom Thomson. This picture, painted in broad, bold strokes, shows a deep affection for Canada's frontier country, its loneliness and its beauty. Others followed Thomson. J.E.H. MacDonald in The Solemn Land shows a poet's feelings for the rolling hills of Algoma. In September Gale, Arthur Lismer paints the howl of the westerly as it lashes the Georgian Bay. Lawren Harris struck a somber note with the gaunt beauty of bare rock and twisted stump above Lake Superior. Like all artists, these men owed much to tradition, but they spoke with a new voice, the voice of Canada. A foundation member of the group, and foremost among those who spoke in this new way, is Alexander Young Jackson. Born in Montreal in 1882, he is today the leading Canadian landscape painter. He has traveled from the whaleback rocks of Georgian Bay to Baffinland and up to the Arctic. He has sketched in Halifax and in the fishing villages of the Gaspé along the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where houses cling to the steep cliffs. In doing so, he has produced his own essence of Canada, vast, rhythmic, vigorous. Jackson lives in the studio building in Toronto. A wealthy fellow artist put up the building for the painters of a generation ago who were searching for something new to say. Here, Jackson works among the tools of his trade, his easel, his paints and brushes, his canvases. Around souvenirs of his lifelong search into the meaning of the Canadian landscape. Jackson's hours are professionally regular. He rises at 7:30 and breakfasts in the shack where Thomson worked in the winters of 1914 to 16. It is still called Tom's Shack. His companion is Keith McKeever, a Scots mining prospector who knows Canada's North Country like his own hand. But the studio is only a part of Jackson's life, for he belongs in the open with the landscapes he paints. One of his favorite sketching grounds is northern Ontario, which he visits in the fall. At Grace Lake, a small mountain tarn just above the Georgian Bay, he has done some of his best work. In October, he packs his brushes, paints, and birch sketching panels and heads north. He looks more like a bushman than a painter, for the best country lies many miles from settlement, and the artist must be able to wield a paddle as well as a brush. At the far end of Cranberry Lake, there's a 3/4 mile portage. As the two men lift the canoe and hoist the duffel onto their backs, they see that the color is good. But red maple and yellow birch and poplar will be bare skeletons in 2 weeks. So once they have pitched camp on the edge of Grace Lake, deep in the La Cloche Hills, Jackson leaves the running of the camp to McKeever and gets to work preparing his sketch box for a day's wandering through the bush. First comes the search for something to paint, the motif, as artists call it. On some days it may come quickly, but on others, Jackson may wander for hours before finding exactly what he wants. Now comes the great adventure. The artists tussle with nature to select only the core of what he sees. Each painting is a fresh problem, yet each problem must be tackled in the same way. For the artist's job is to examine the pattern of nature and then to get at its basic design. He must instantly grasp its inner structure of line and mass. With his brush, he must clear away the bric-a-brac, eliminate what is unnecessary. Like the musician, the artist takes a theme, the curve of a rock, the line of a hill, and builds it into a design by the use of contrasting themes of color, light, and shape. He sees an accidental grouping of rocks, a pattern of trees along the lakeshore, and he makes that pattern important to us by stripping it down until we see in it the essence of all rocks and trees. It is work of intense concentration, for it is really research into the structure of what we see. But from the painter's rich chords of color, crimson for maples, viridian for spruce, blue and madder for rocks and sky, comes an entirely fresh statement about the scene that caught his eye. Jackson has made such a statement about the Canadian North. He has caught the sluggish rhythm of the oldest hills in the world.
When I'm making a sketch, I try to emphasize the things I want and ignore the things I don't want. I like to think of a sketch not as a little picture, but rather as an idea for a big one. A close resemblance to the subject is only a minor virtue. You may try to get an effect of light or an arrangement of color or certain relationships of form and line, but what you always strive for is an intensification of nature. So often the northern landscape is a crowded confusion of shapes and colors, and you have to reduce it to some kind of order. A tree sticking up in the center is better moved to the side. There is a flicker of blue on the little lake. You make it into a generous space. Anything you need you will find, but you must sense the need of it. The artist in front of nature does not think only of composition or of form and tone and color. On the contrary, when you are on the alert, such things become instinctive. And it is surprising how quickly you can make decisions in sketching under pressure of changing weather, shifting shadows, and other difficulties. The final canvas, if there is ever to be one, will not be judged by its likeness to the scene which inspired it. Just imitating nature was never the artist's intention. Whether you take nature itself or the perfect replica by photography, either one remains the same starting point. From this starting point, the painter must select and create his own interpretation of the scene.
So another problem has been solved, and back at the camp, the sketch joins a rapidly growing pile. When winter comes, Jackson will use some of them for canvases. In the early spring, Jackson makes his annual trip down to Quebec. His painting ground lies near the village of Saint-Tite-Cap, perched high on the hills overlooking the lower St. Lawrence. He leaves the land where man is still something of a stranger for the land where man has lived for 300 years and more. In April, when winter frosts loosen their grip and the sun climbs higher over the rounded contours of the snow-covered hills, he finds the subjects for some of his best-known canvases. Typical is the barns. Each morning he prepares his sketch box and dons snowshoes for a tramp over the deep snow in search of something to paint. He is a familiar figure in these parts. Père Raquette, the Habitant farmers call him, Father Snowshoe. In such weather, Jackson works fast, for the chilly air may thicken up his paint, making it too stiff for use. But once again, his job is to simplify, to get the essentials of the landscape into sharp focus. He quickly catches the shifting forms and colors and sets them down in rich strokes of blue, madder, and white. The Quebec country is superb. Fences give another pattern to the rolling contour of the hills. In the early spring light, the subtle blues and pinks emerge more clearly from the deep snow. But Jackson's essence of Quebec is in sharp contrast to his sketches of the North Country. He gives us here the broad sweep of rounded hills and weaves into them the pattern of man's handiwork, sharp accents of farmhouses in the valley, and over all, the peace of the land and its people waiting for the warm spring sun. As evening falls, Jackson returns to the home of Joseph Tremblay. Here he relaxes with his French-Canadian friends over a game of pique-dame. Back at the studio in Toronto comes another problem, building up a new design on a large canvas, working to transform the pattern of the sketch into a new order. As he puts in his underpainting, Jackson prepares for changes. This is another job. He will not imitate the sketch. Each stroke of the brush brings alterations, and it is in watching the brush at work that we see how the painter transmits to the canvas the sense of beauty that is in him. The way a man wields a brush, the way he applies color, are as individual as handwriting and just as revealing. For it is only by constant change and development that the artist can give us exactly what he wants us to see. It is only by continual research that Jackson can get into his paintings the essence of the landscape he saw. It may be the fishing villages along the south shore of the St. Lawrence where men gain a hard living from the sea. It may be the gaunt hills that lie far to the north of the Arctic Circle. In every picture is a simple statement, richly painted, of the structure of the Canadian scene. And that is what people feel when they look at his canvases. This essence of Canada lies also in Jackson's earlier paintings. The subtle tones of Night, Georgian Bay, where subdued blues and greens give us the ghostly atmosphere of moonlight. Red maple with its bright reds and whites and its bold accent on detail. The feeling of endless space in Northland Hilltop. Early spring, Quebec, where the old hills throw up a rampart behind the ancient farmlands. And so, though he works a 10-hour day in the studio, it is in the open that Jackson belongs, out in the vast hinterland which has challenged him as it has all Canadian painters. From the United States border to the North Pole, from the cliffs of Labrador to the Pacific and Alaska, the great subcontinent of Canada stretches out. The weathered farms of the old province of Quebec, the endless expanse of the great western prairies, the tangled peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Above all, the silent barrens that lie beyond the fringe of settled Canada. Jackson has reacted to this landscape, putting down in paint what many feel, but few can ever express. But the landscape is endless in its variety, and it remains as a challenge to the painters of each generation, a vast, unsentimental land.
Mr. Lismer? Mr. Lismer?
Hello there.
Oh, Mr. Lismer, I brought Anne-Marie to the nursery.
Those are the 10-year-olds. They're preparing for a pageant. They're always like that. Hello, sweetheart.
What are you going to do?
Paint.
Paint? Would you like to come along and see all the other little children?
Yes.
It's her first time, you know.
It's your first time.
I think she won't be too shy.
Oh,
Children have long been Arthur Lismer's special study. In his art centers in Toronto and later in Montreal, he has carried on a developing experiment in education through art. When we look at their drawings and paintings, says Lismer, we see that in them, children often show us their inner thoughts and feelings. They give us a clue to their hopes and their happiness, their troubles and frustrations. Always they are trying to get through to us some indication of their personality and growth. We adults must try to understand what children are telling us, because this knowledge enables us to work with them, to help them to think and judge for themselves, and to guide them towards the kind of life that they desire.
Hello. Did you want me to do some painting for you?
Yes.
Would you like me to do one now?
Yes.
Oh, let's go. Let's try it. I think I've got a chalk to start with, like that.
No, I like...
Well, you hold the brush after for me. You hold it ready for me. Do you know what a little squirrel looks like? Now, here's his furry back. These are his eyes. And this is the branch he's sitting on. See?
Mm.
It's whiskers, you see. I want a brush. Give me the brush. Right. Right, it's black one. Here's the
What is that? A squirrel.
Now then. Now you paint something for me, eh? You paint something. There. Clean sheet for you.
Can I paint you something?
No, you what's Daniel?
I want to paint too. Me too. Here. Here's one.
In the course of his busy life, Lismer has directed several art schools and trained many aspiring artists. In addition, he has taught architectural, fine arts, and other university students, and has been a tireless lecturer to an interested public.
Oh, Mr. Lismer. Oh, I simply must tell you how much I enjoyed your talk the other night. It was so beautiful. Art is so educational, isn't it? I mean, it really helps you to see things, doesn't it? You know, I wouldn't miss one of your talks for the world. I'm coming to every one of your lectures.
Have you seen this picture?
Oh, yes.
It's a Matisse.
It's beautiful.
Yes. The sea, so quiet. And the silent woman. Is everybody here?
Yes, sir.
Let's begin with the children.
Along with all his other activities, Lismer has trained many teachers. 2 generations of teachers have carried his ideas and methods across Canada and into many other parts of the world. Through them, Lismer's influence has contributed to a gradual change in formal education. Whatever the project, whether it be puppets or clay modeling or building in miniature, or any of the varied activities through which children can express what they know and feel about life, Lismer has emphasized the development of personality and ideas rather than technical skill, understanding rather than factual knowledge, experience rather than imitation. Through observing and taking part, the student teachers learn to understand the children's creative expressions. They are taught to organize activities which will help young people to get the idea of unity in a well-ordered society. Above all, Lismer encourages them to be sympathetic and open-minded, and to be ready to put aside outmoded standards and formulae in favor of fresh ways of seeing and doing things. Recognizing the importance of this kind of education through art, a leading Canadian university has established a special course to train teachers by these new methods. In addition to budding artists and university students, Lismer teaches groups of ordinary people who know very little about formal art, but not without guidance.
Take off the toothpaste. Fingers were made before brushes. Look at the markings sometimes. Marvelous what you can see if you really look for it. That's good. Yeah. Ah, you see the difference?
Lismer has encouraged many adult groups. He believes that adults, like children, can be enriched by the experience of art, however little they think they know, however fumbling their first efforts.
Better take a rest, model. You're turning green here.
In brief periods, rescued from his busy life as an educator, Lismer has worked at his own painting. Lismer's paintings reveal, perhaps more clearly than any other record, his personal development as a man and as an artist. Lismer first saw Canada through English eyes. This was in 1913, shortly after he had left his native Yorkshire, where he had painted the pastoral countryside. But the rugged Canadian landscape was quite another matter. Lismer recognized the inconsistency and saw the challenge. Almost immediately, his painting took on a new vividness. The Guide's Home, painted in 1914, was his first real reaction to the Ontario Northland. But here, the method was derived largely from the vibrant color techniques of the Impressionists. It was not natural to either Lismer or this frontier land. Like other artists of the group of seven, he sought for more appropriate means of expression. In Winter Camouflage, painted during the First World War, the larger forms of the Canadian landscape began to emerge. With rock, pine, and sunlight, this movement developed rapidly. And by 1921, Lismer had caught the elemental power of the North Country. In September Gale, the opposing forces of nature clash in dramatic conflict. This theme was to recur again and again through most of his work. By now, Lismer had come to terms with the Canadian landscape. His manner was confident and his attitude calm. Many large canvases followed, like Isles of Spruce and the solitary pine tree, whose twisted, weather-beaten boughs were later to become a symbol of the battle of the elements. We have a background of epic grandeur, declared Lismer. And in this happy vein, he painted October on the North Shore. This was during the optimistic 1920s, when he also painted McGregor Bay Islands and the happy Isles of Georgian Bay. But the sunlight was not to last. Troubled times followed. And once more, storm and struggle entered Lismer's canvases. In Pine Rack, painted in 1933, the forces of nature were again in conflict. But the stage had narrowed, and the focus was upon the actors in the struggle. Later paintings reveal a growing concern with the fate of smaller forms. And then, in Canadian Jungle, the artist penetrated the surface of the undergrowth and found there both conflict and strange beauty. Lismer's later work has a quality of lyric charm. The storm has passed and all is seemingly at peace. But his observation is keener than ever, and his comments based on fuller understanding. He has turned to the familiar objects of everyday life, and painting with a vivid, deft technique, he has recorded them with kindly interest, sympathy, and humor. In a final analysis, it may be decided that these small compositions contain his greatest wisdom. For they are the summation of a full life, richly lived, and are perhaps Lismer's most personal statements.
Sure, it's a grand place. Okay, we'll paint it. Gosh, I'm hungry. Anything to eat? Come on, let's go out. Anything worthwhile? No, nothing, nothing at all. The same old thing, war, fear, misery. Ah.
Prisoners, 1918. Frederick Varley was then a Canadian war artist. vanquished and victor alike, plodded the same dirty road. Even nature seemed caught and torn from her original intention. Someday the people will return. Here his irony was even more bitter. Everything is smashed, he said. The homes are gone, even the graves are gone. And then he painted his overwhelming sense of the desolation and futility of life and titled it, For What? Yet, Varley seems to have found, if not meaning, then pleasure and beauty in life, and the need to create beauty. Such is the conflict in this man. On the one hand, an intellectual denial of life. On the other hand, an emotional response to the beauty and wonder of living. Varley's inner honesty has determined his way of life and the pattern of his work. He has never been fashionable because instinctively he has probed every subject and always clearly reflected his own feelings. At times, Varley and his surroundings have been in perfect harmony. From the West, he wrote to a friend,
British Columbia is heaven. It trembles within me and pains me with its wonder, as when a child I first awoke to the song of the earth at home.
In that lyric period, Varley not only heard the song of the earth, but also the song of the sea. Sea music lets the wind and waves sing lovingly, and the woman responds to the sea. Humanity and nature are one. But there were other times when circumstances pressed in upon him. Then a bitter period of despair and inaction would follow. And the artist in him died. But each time he was reborn. And always, whether his mood was austere or passionate, his honesty remained. He gave each subject its individual expression. And so from work to work, his technique is never quite the same. But when once more the world descended into war, the painful question came again. For what? Then the most tortured face that Varley painted was his own. Work was impossible, life absurd. Yet there was so much in him that still wanted to live. Slowly, painfully, a new, unfettered man emerged. In 1945, aged 66, Varley painted Liberation.